Hello, friends. It's Chapo. The Korean War at that exact moment. But in fact, that disintegrates the closer you look at it, because for several years before the quote unquote Korean War, tens of thousands of people, as many as 100,000 people, were slaughtered in the South, Koreans, by the Southern government under suspicion that they were communistic or, plotting against the government or just too independent. There's an island called Jeju Island in which most of this happened because it was supposed to be an autonomous island and the government cracked down. So how much sense does it make that before the Korean War, quote unquote, started, 100,000 Koreans were dead? And then you start to see that the division of Korea itself in World War II was actually just another escalation of what had long been a conflict between nationalists, communists, collaborators with the Japanese, and that this has been a civil war boiling for a long time that entered a new phase in 1950. And in fact, most of the border clashes leading up to 1950 were started by the South, not the North. And of course, there was
Talk
this massive
shit, get hit.
there was this massive extermination campaign, as it was called at the time, in the South. So you can get into the ways that the North justified its attack. But ultimately what it was trying to do is what both regimes wanted to do, which was unify Korea. This 38th parallel, this line was by everyone seen as temporary. And it was not
That's an
a
important
border.
point that you guys make in the first episode. This idea of the 38th parallel, the North Korean soldiers, like they crossed the 38th parallel. The 38th parallel was not in any sense an internationally recognized border. It was a line that was drawn by like essentially the U.S. State Department.
Correct.
And so the fact that like the North Koreans, they did they didn't recognize or disrespected it. Well, like no one else in the world did either. This is a line that the U.S. drew to separate the communist North from like the nationalist, capitalist, our allies in the South.
And the U.S. officials, State Department, whatever, it was a sacrosanct line when the North crossed it. When we pushed the North out of the South Korea and then, quote unquote, rolled back into North Korea, it was then referred to as a quote unquote imaginary line. So when the North Koreans are crossing a border in their own divided country, it's a sacred line that everyone recognizes, and they're violating international norms. When we do it, it's an imaginary line. So I think that very idea complicates the entire notion of Koreans invading Korea. So this is something we try to lay out in the show. And then, of course, along with that, hopefully, nice bit of context, you then see what the war actually was like and why China, for example, started to participate in the war later on.
I want to get into the actual prosecution of the war, how brutal it was, and some of the characters involved on both sides. But before we get into that, I want to talk about like North Korea, because like as a result of the Korean War, or the fact that it was on, I guess from our side, a loss or a draw, if you want to be charitable. Korea, there are two Koreas. Like there's North Korea and South Korea, and just sort of the ways in which North Korea is still talked about to this day, because it was a member of the axis of evil. It has nuclear weapons. It's testing missiles. It is still very much considered like a rogue state that is talked about and imagined as both an existential threat to peace and security of the world, if not like even like the West Coast of the United States in terms of their missiles, but also at the same time a completely backwards bankrupt backwater joke of a country. And with like a totalitarian, like abused populace who like cries every time they say or think the name dear leader and all this shit. But like but you can, like, in the first episode of the show, you have a quote from you have that like famous quote from Donald Rumsfeld, where he's talking about, if you look at like the satellite images of North and South Korea at night, you will see the South lit up like a Christmas tree, a vital center of commerce, capitalism, and global markets. And then you look at the North, across the 38th parallel, it's just black. It might as well be off the map. It might as well be the fucking ocean. It's just like it doesn't exist. And he's like, how could this come to be? And then like you have a quote from someone, one of the guests you interviewed, that talked about sort of the artificial way in which that satellite image is created, despite like whatever reality it reflects. But like just in terms of what does that comment by Rumsfeld reflect on how America sees North Korea and its people and like its culture and just the history of that country?
Yeah, it's one that doesn't seem to deserve a history in America. It's a country that we just, I think, really in the 1990s is when it becomes the sort of Saddam Gaddafi style heel. Because as a tiny bit of context, up until that point, because North Korea had a horrible decade in the 1990s, up until that point, North Korea had long outpaced the South in development. It industrialized very quickly. Somehow it was able to rebuild from being 40, every city being 40 to 90% destroyed in the war, to turning things around quite quickly, delivering a higher standard of living. And it was actually the North back in those days that would send food aid to the South. I don't think people in our day and age can really conceive that. What went wrong in the 90s was they were obviously denied of the majority of their trading network once the Soviet bloc fell apart. They were victim of sanctions by the United States, and then there were two horrible floods that racked the country, followed by a drought, and that any road to recovery was blocked at every turn by the United States because we wanted to starve them out, literally. And there was a famine in which at least 500,000 people died. So at that point, the North is also starting to look for a nuclear guarantee, which itself is impressive if you think about it, because up until that moment, the North actually was very late to the nuclear party on the South, on the Korean Peninsula. We introduced nukes there in the 50s. The South tried to start its own clandestine program in the 80s or the 70s. And it wasn't until basically the late 80s that the North said, I guess we should start thinking about a guarantee. This is after being demolished as a state by being holocausted essentially by the United States only a couple decades before. So the state obviously reflects that reality. It's a bit of it is a garrison state. There are some interesting parallels with Israel, actually. I wouldn't say point for point, but there's some funny coincidences. But we exaggerate the level of grayness and totalitarianism there. And I'm not saying that political practice in North Korea is a great model, but it's very explainable, and it is deeply, deeply exaggerated. I think in our first episode on I Run This Montage, there's this one MSNBC lady who she's listing the horrible things about North Korea and the what sets it apart from the world. And on that list is murder. And it's just like, crime. It's one of those. It's one of the few countries where crimes happen. It's just like anything. It's like, why is that on the list? And then of course there's all these other great things she says.
Did you know North Korea? Do you know North Korea keeps a significant population of their own citizens in prison?
No, yeah. Brendan, it's different though. It's their state authorities do the murder.
Yeah.
Do you think of any other country where that happens?
No, we don't do that here.
No. And there's a real money quote where she says, they actually organize their people into a class-based system that orders their lives. Wow, that sounds terrible. But anyway,
and also it's like, it's bad there. I sure wouldn't want to live there. But I wonder why North Korea is like that. What happened?
Yeah. And then of course on the nuclear question, just to close it out. And by the way, like it is not one giant concentration camp. That is a parody of what it is like there. There are obviously restrictions on a lot of things that Americans would not want, and it doesn't mean that it's a lovely place to live at all times. Although again, I think we do cartoonize what the entirety of the country is, and we speak to several people who have been there, and they have a very different picture than what you would hear on the news. However, the other thing
Dennis
is the nuclear
Rodman, featured guest,
co-host. But the nuclear point is another point entirely, which is not hard probably for listeners of this show to understand, that they don't want to go the way of Saddam and Gaddafi, much as Iran did not want to go that way.
Well, and that's the other, I think, one of the things that the Korea story, I think, sort of really tests the American liberal stomach of, which is that it's not a there's it is not a government that conforms to the American stereotype of what a quote unquote free society is supposed to look like. To use how John Foster Dulles himself characterized, the free world to which a state like South Korea belonged, whereas North Korea didn't. And in spite of that, it's also then you look at the overwhelming evidence, which is that the New York Times will run gigantic, glitzy, interactive investigations into how North Korea illegally gets oil. Why is it a problem that North Korea gets oil? Because apparently you can use it for weapons. You also can use it to keep people's lights on and help them get to work and stuff. But like, it can also be used for guns. So, you know, we treat it and have made it into like a pariah state that is, you know, like the Nazis, except like it's still around, and in spite of it, as if like, you know, again, and this is where I think like there also comes up where it's that like, well, why is it that this government is able to stay in power there, you know, for 70 years? And it, you know, and why is this continuity of government exist? And a lot of it is this idea again of like, you know, brainwashed Orientals or something like that. And it is, you know, it's not, it couldn't at all be because of, you know, our crazy sanctions or the, you know, like salt the earth, you know, like war
Also-
that we waged.
Also, there have been many times that the governments in both North and South have tried to take steps toward reunification, because that was the goal of the of the North Koreans in the 1950s, as it was also the goal of the South. Both of them didn't recognize the 38th parallel, and they wanted to reunify the country. The difference was the North had a broadly popular government that was socialistic, which is the type of politics that got you killed in the South, and a lot of people had them. And the South was a deeply corrupt and unpopular government that had already killed tens of thousands, if not 100,000 people. And so the North calculated almost correctly that it could unify the peninsula by force and that this re-government would collapse, which it actually did until we stepped in.
Because people want to, when they imagine North Korea in 1950s, and they imagine it as the Hermit Kingdom dictatorship, but like the communists in North Korea had the same popular legitimacy that they did in Europe at that point, because
Correct.
they were the ones who
Yes.
driving out the
Yes.
fucking fascists.
To that point, actually, to that point, I think like this would be a good point to contrast the leaders of the Korean War on the north and southern sides.
Sure.
Kim Il Sung in the north and Syngman Rhee in the south. What are their biographies and like leadership styles? What does that tell you about the respective political movements and the forces that they represented and the forces that brought them into conflict?
Sure. I'll take Rhee, you take Kim.
Sure.
I guess with Rhee, Rhee is he is basically able to be a credible political figure in South Korea at the time of the sort of events of our story in the late 40s and early 50s, because yes, he was, against Japan, but he wasn't in the country, so he couldn't have collaborated with Japan and to have then discredited himself. So he's like, as he is the
Which most of the other Southern leadership was tainted by
so
collaboration.
He's like how Okrumbo got to not vote for the Iraq War, even though he was in the fucking Illinois State Senate.
or how Rumsfeld was sent to Brussels before Watergate happened, so he didn't have his political career tarnished by Watergate. Yes, Syngman Rhee was getting a bunch of PhDs in America.
Right. He studied with Woodrow Wilson, who's also, viewed as like, at least on the international level, like as the kind of father of, liberal internationalism and so on. And Syngman Rhee, certainly, like spent a lot, studied under him and came away and went back to be a statesman in his home country and promptly turns into a gangster autocrat.
Yeah.
He is he consolidates all of the power in the state as much as he can in the executive. And a lot of the way in which the power is enforced locally. I mean, it's in the second season, when we talk about Cuba in the 1940s and 50s, we describe it, borrowing the title of a book, gangsterismo, which is to say that you have a, sort of backwards agriculture economy, and then the nascent bourgeois life is just plagued with corruption and graft.
Yeah.
And it's dominated by right-wing and military figures. And Syngman Rhee is, just sort of like, he's a great example of how, often the heads of these movements are just not remarkable, other than just that, like, they're brutal and venal figures who represent the brutality and venality of their right-wing, political movement so perfectly.
And just to put a finer point on it, that the nature of the government in the South with Syngman Rhee at the top was overwhelmingly Japanese collaborators, or rather collaborators with Imperial Japan, which was for decades, the colonial occupier of Korea. That meant that the government was, from the get-go, and the U.S. had a part in putting that government together, since we were occupying the South,
and
for
not just
years.
like the same DMV officials went over, but like like literally the same like secret police officials from who are one day working for the Japanese are not if not literally the next, maybe a couple weeks later, working for the South Koreans.
Also paramilitary groups, a lot of youths, like sort of brown shirt style gangs, stuff like that. Now in the North, there was Kim Il Sung, and his sort of comrades from World War II, because unlike Syngman Rhee, Kim had been fighting in really the worst of the worst conditions in Manchuria during World War II. And there was even the Japanese hated him so much. He was such a particularly effective resistance figure that they founded a Get Kim squad to specifically hunt down and kill Kim Il Sung. So that's a pretty good pedigree when liberation happens and people are looking for a leader. And he and several of his top guys were like the Cuban guerrillas. They were known for actually sticking around and fighting for the country. United States and South Korea, for decades, it was the official line that Kim Il Sung was in fact an imposter who had stolen a dead guerrilla's identity in order to take
He was
power
Don
in North
fucking
Korea.
Draper.
Yes.
Talk about-
By the way, that was the, it was kind of startling to read, going back and reading, the New York Times articles, about like Korea at this time. And then you just see it's right there that like Kim Il Sung, who is an imposter, whose identity was believed to have been stolen. And it's, under like Hanson Baldwin, their military editor or whatever, like it's very, the
kooky myths go all the way back.
Yes. Like it's and that's that's a pretty top shelf goofy crazy myth, I'll concede, but there is a lot of other stuff of that caliber in this story for sure.
It's like when people think that that Joe Brandon is dead and he or what do people think he's dead? Is that a current?
No,
Honestly, no. I think they're more happy. People who hate Brandon right now are much more happy with people thinking, "Yeah, that's really him." That's the president.
I think what you're thinking about is the people who think Joe Kennedy Jr. is alive.
Okay, yeah.
I think
And
that
he
would be-
looks
that
like
would be-
he looks like this like homely Italian man.
yeah.
But yes. So anyway, the differences reflected in the government again, with the South being a gangster state, the North was kind of your typical, mid-century socialist thing, where yes, there was basically a one-party state governing with a popular revolutionary program to redistribute land, to reform education, health. There was a literacy program just like there was in Cuba, and of course, very different attitude toward the collaborators with Japan, which again was legitimizing.
And you also brought up the Manchuria point, which I think is crucial to bring up, which is that like, this was an internationalist like struggle. Like it wasn't like the Korean War. Yes, it was a, Korean civil war functionally, but it was also, taken in a wider context. It was also part of the struggle where you had many of the people leading the struggle for the North in North Korea. They had become, battle tested and had effectively, cut their teeth fighting in Manchuria in these like horrid conditions. So, Kim, in a sense, like, yes, he and his core guerrillas were in Manchuria. And what's more, so much of the leader, the leadership and the strategy and the tactics and just the manpower of the KPA, the Korean People's Army, had they had been forged in their own crucible of Manchuria, which, by the way, then you wonder, like, gee, why is it that the brainwashing movie The Manchurian Candidate is about a bunch of people who can't remember all this stuff that is again related to this
the shock troops, when the Americans initially get their asses kicked in June 1950, they were all guys coming back from Manchuria. So yes, it was very different governments, but they were essentially thought to be temporary states, that there was going to be a reunification, which nowadays, North and South Korea sounds as natural as North and South Carolina, but this was such a live question for decades. And in fact, war almost broke out again several times because of how live a question it was.
Okay, so those are the people like on the North and South Korean side. Basically, like the South Korean government were sort of gangster nationalists and Japanese collaborators, and the North were basically the people who fought the Japanese. But yeah,
You got Robin Hood versus Vidkun Quisling here. Who are you going to pick if you're just a regular, simple Korean peasant?
Also,
who's going to be your
just wanna
democratic preference?
I just want to add on that point of democracy. the first mass elections, is Susie Kim, who's also the scholar who makes the point about Rumsfeld you mentioned earlier. She's a guest on the show. Incredibly great book called Everyday Life in the North Korean Revolution. She points out that the first mass elections in Korea ever were in not the democracy of South Korea that we sponsored. They were in the North. And it was a preferential voting system. It wasn't exactly like American elections, but it was massively enthusiastic.
Yeah, it wasn't like
people-
American elections. It worked.
Yeah, and that is how people made, the democratic decisions. Now, of course, the war brutalized a lot of stuff, including political practice in the North, and a lot of this more openly participatory stuff gets subsumed into a classic.
We saw that. That was
Yeah,
that was
exactly.
that was the goal.
Yeah.
Make sure this does not happen.
So the North, nevertheless, had to, by the political logic, it took on the popular elements of what was going on in that revolution. Because Korea had a revolution just like Cuba had a revolution. It's just kind of overshadowed by the fact that their revolution was met by even more violently than Cuba's was by a whole assault on the peninsula.
I think that's because it was defining the new terrain. Because if you think of I endorse the Michael Judge thesis of the Cold War as really World War III.
This is Mike Judge of Beavis and Butthead.
Yes. No, Death was just around the corner. Another podcaster. Shout out to him. He's talked about how the Cold War is better understood as World War III, as the continuation of really the Second War after what the West understood to be essentially a truce, in which the communist bloc sort of thought of as like a more permanent armistice, similar to the way Stalin and Hitler viewed the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, and that the Korean War is the first like hot outburst of a war that is going to continue across the world, but just not in Europe until 1991, basically.
Well, I mean, definitely the United States, the flashiest, aspects of foreign policy that were being talked about, all centered around Europe, and Asia was just not supposed to matter, at least as far as prestigious ideas of American, post-war policy went. But then, yeah, as you say, the first thing that breaks out, quote unquote, breaks out is in Asia. But for that reason, it was all the more sort of deranged that this idea of Stalin commanding his puppet in North Korea, because by the way, the Russians or the Soviets did not install Kim Il-sung. Stalin didn't want much to do with the Korean War at all. Kim said, is this all right with you? Stalin's the biggest, most powerful head of a communist state. So Kim ran it by him, but Stalin didn't command him to do it. He actually said, you also should, make sure that Mao's okay with you doing this. But no one ordered him to do it. It was his own policy because he was